Those of us who are barristers are used to standing up, and I think it's sometimes it helps, even though it's a rather cosy seminar. I thought, does that make any difference? Sit down. I thought I'd make it interactive this morning, because I'm really grateful to see people who got up on a Sunday morning and remember to flop. So, if there's a thought you have, I've done this before, I'm addressing an audience, and somebody says, but wait a minute, fine, just say what you have to say. There is a later session, I think John's chairing my left, and so obviously that'll be another opportunity. Anyway, I thought what I'd do, first of all, to ease you into the day, is just to say a bit about my experience, because in a sense, yesterday, I apologise for not being here all day, you got a superb sort of summaries of all the principles and all the factors and all the elements, so it seemed to me to go through those again would be repetition, and we all are aware that repetition is somewhat boring and tedious, so I'm not doing that. So I thought what I'd do, and I think it's on the agenda anyway, is really lift all of that and show you how it has worked and is still working. And I've been a great supporter, proponent, or whatever. And I was reminded yesterday by Andrew's talk that it goes back a long way. These things they're not suddenly mushrooms that have appeared in the middle of the forest today. They've been there for a long time, and there's a lot of experience to draw on. And I'd just like to say, to follow up what he said, that what is actually needed at this juncture is the ability to pull together all these strands of experience, because all the models are slightly different depending on the circumstances. So it's not, one glove fits all. It's looking at how it organically grows out of demands from the communities and so on. So to have those examples all in one place, either online or in a book, and I talked last night to somebody who seems to be quite willing to get the ball rolling on this, so that those who are in other circumstances wanting to get something off the ground, you know where to go, because networking is important. You need to know who are the people who've already done it, how did it work, why did it work. Some of that I'll touch on. So resource, number one, because this conference, to be honest, I hate conferences. You come out and you walk away, and then you wonder what you've really achieved. This conference will achieve a great deal. You had a wonderful film last night, so you have a memory, so you're feeling empowered from seeing how it works. But also, for the future, what is it, where's it going to go? And that, I think, the objective of getting a resource for everybody is important. So that's one feature I would like to see carried forward, my experience, which I'd like to see fitted into this. And I thought about it, and I often forget how old I am and how long I've been at this job. And the thing is, I've done these before. Now, I'm just going to run through a few, and I'm going to concentrate on some rather than others. The first one I was involved with, it was in the 1980s. And I'm talking about, to begin with, domestic ones here in the United Kingdom. Now, in the 1980s, there was, and I'm assuming that you may not necessarily have been living or even necessarily born at this time in the United Kingdom. But there were civil disturbances in the 1980s in major cities, mainly linked to race issues. One of them took place on an estate in North London, which has actually been rekindled, in a sense, by the Mark Duggan inquest, which you may or may not have read about last autumn. I was also involved in that. But in the 1980s, a police officer called Keith Blakelock got killed, murdered, on Broadwater Farm. Now, obviously there's a history to that. I'm not going to go into it, but the community in that area, in North London, were very unhappy about how policing had been conducted in that area, how relations with the local authority had been conducted in that area. They wanted brought out into the open what their grievances were, because they knew that the system wasn't going to produce that. So they asked, me and a number of other people, to, as it were, contrive a model for which they could have. And so there was a panel, but of course the difficulty with that then, maybe less difficulty now, mentioned yesterday, of course, how do you get police officers to come along to an informal panel, one that isn't officially approved? And so obviously we had to tread very carefully in coming to findings when some of the main characters refused to cooperate. But there was a Broadwater Farm report, It's still around, maybe online by now, and so you can get more detail about how that worked. But it worked quite well in the sense that it gave a voice. That's what it was doing then. Just giving a voice to the people who hadn't been heard for decades in relation, and of course it goes back through to Notting Hill and other areas of London. So that was the first one. However, I did another one in Ireland, and it was called the Shoot to Kill Inquiry in a place called Armagh. Now, again, I have to assume you may not know where Armagh is or anything about the Troubles or what was going on. Big issue for Irish communities was the British government unspoken, unwritten policy where they have roadblocks, as they did then, less now, hardly ever at all now, in the border country between north and south of Ireland. And the policy that seemed to be pursued on the face of it was that if you didn't stop, you were shot dead. End of story. And there were a number of cases like that, but the British government of course denied it, and there were never any cases brought against the perpetrators. Well, there was in the end, but not at the beginning. So they asked if I would do this. Now this was at a time when it was extremely dangerous to do these kind of, I had to have armed escort to do it with two others, one American jurist and another English one. So there were three of us. And so we were under armed guard, not official armed guard. It was the dissidents who made sure we got to the place safely, that we weren't blown up while we were doing it, and we were able to conduct a report and have it filed, as it were, as to what was going on. And that, again, at that stage, was purely to give vent officially to what they were saying is going on the streets of the United Kingdom, which, of course, linked in eventually to Bloody Sunday, and I sat on that, or at least I represented families in that, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which was looking at the same kind of things, but much, much later. Mine was informal. So that was the second one. But then since then, those are two domestic examples going way back. Since then, I've done a number of others, but I just want to interpose a couple. Iran you know about, so I'm not going to talk about that. I've done that as a judge, and very honoured to do it, and I've always remembered that scene. I don't know whether it's in the film, you know, where all the relatives towards the end. Is it in the film? Oh, well, you've seen it. You know what I'm talking about. They raise the photographs of everybody, and it's like the mothers of the disappeared in South America. It's the same effect. Because it brings home to you, you know, all of us sitting there, you go, and you've been listening to, you know, terrible stories, heartrending stories, and then you see the photographs, and it's like a mass grave in front of you, like the graves in northern France after the Second World War. So that, for me, was a very moving occasion. Enough about Iran. But then also, ta-da, Pierre, the Russell Tribunal. I do want to say a little bit about it, although Pierre is, if you like, not the only inspirational figure. Stefan Hessel, who you may or may not have heard of, who was one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was also was possibly the moving force for regenerating Russell. Yesterday it was mentioned frequently in the context of Vietnam, and I'm not saying everybody has heard of it. As Andrew said, you walk out in the street and probably nobody's even heard of Bertrand Russell, never mind the Russell Tribunal. So, you know, we've moved on. However, I do want to say just something about the Russell Tribunal, because there have been 6 sessions. It's travelled around the world. It started in Barcelona, where we were talking about the complicity of the European Union and states within the European Union in relation to Israel, preferential treatment and so on. So we were looking at that, and what was fascinating was that a huge hall in Barcelona was completely filled for these hearings, which were spread over 2 to 3 days, because that's the other constriction. Nobody can afford a full-scale inquiry taking many weeks or months. It's constricted into 1 or 2 days. But nevertheless, in 1 or 2 days, we've got witnesses coming. Pierre can deal with the actual mechanics of it, because I want to deal with the mechanics of another one. And so after Barcelona, we went to London. We looked at the corporate responsibility for what is going on in Israel. I paused for a minute. This wasn't about so much establishing the violations. And to answer a question that was posed yesterday, most people know what the conclusions are before you start. Yes, that's a given. The problem is not identifying the violations, because in most cases they have already been identified. The real question is how do you rectify that? How do you bring about redress? So the criticism that is often levelled at people's tribunals, commissions, whatever you want to call them, is that they're prejudging. They're not prejudging in the sense that there have been judgments. There have been fact-finding missions already, especially in relation to Israel. Russell was set up on the back of a major ruling by the court in The Hague, sometimes called the World Court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. In 2004, there was a judgment called the Wall, because it was about the wall. You all know about the wall. You know how it divides communities and goes straight through houses and gardens, and people can't get across. And if they try and get across, it's like the Berlin Wall. So it was about that. And the judgment, I normally carry it like a Bible everywhere, because if I speak without it, they might say to me, oh, you would say that, wouldn't you? You're coming from that. And I say, no, sorry, I'm not saying this. The World Court has already said, the ICJ, has already ruled 14 judges to 1 against what has happened, ruling that the wall is illegal, ruling that effectively dividing settlements and putting new settlements in is illegal. So it's not me saying it, it's 14 others saying it. Not that Israel takes the slightest notice of that. However, and that's why Russell came into being, to say to the world that an international court like that, who's already found these violations, now we need to see how, if they're not going to do something about it, and the ICJ said to the United Nations that set it up, you've got to do something about it. You, the United Nations, have got to do something about all these violations for which there is no accountability. So that's why we had Russell. So we moved from Barcelona to London, then we went to South Africa. We went to Cape Town. And why did we go there? Because that's the one city in the whole world that appreciates the terminology apartheid. Now, I don't need to explain that to you. But what we were trying to say was that, oh, I thought it was a drink, was that is precisely what's happening in Israel and the occupied territories. Not just the occupied territories, but Israel as well. That was the function of that hearing in South Africa, because there were experts who could describe, and it's not the same as South Africa, it's different, it's worse. Now that was an interesting watershed, because following that hearing, and it's important that these People's Tribunals Commissions aren't just sidelined, aren't, as it were, seen as some maverick organisation by people wearing, hair shirts and sandals. No, it's not. And what Russell has achieved, Pierre being behind it as well, is recognition. The Israeli government suddenly woke up to the fact that they couldn't ignore us. In fact, they interrupted the proceedings in Cape Town, and I can describe that if necessary. So they were watching. They knew what we were doing. As a result of those hearings, I and a number of others addressed CERD, which is another of these acronyms, which is the United Nations Committee in Geneva for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we went there with one objective. We wanted to say to the United Nations, not only have these violations happened, you have actually got to employ the right terminology. You've actually got to face the facts. The facts are there, face them, and then do something about it. They had never themselves. They criticised Israel. They have these meetings regularly, and countries are supposed to report back as to what they're doing in relation to race relations. Well, Israel always produces 3 volumes, but doesn't deal with Palestine. 3 volumes of material defending individual acts of racism which they describe as non-racism. So they're defending their position, but they don't actually take on the major issue. But on this occasion, for the very first time, a UN body employed the term apartheid when they wrote their report. A strong report. I'm not putting it down just to Russell. We were one of a number of organisations, but in a sense we spearheaded this. And as I was there doing it, I could see the effect on the 19-member committee from all over the world of what we were saying. Now that has a trickle-down effect, because there are lots of NGOs throughout the world who need the material that we have put together. They need to, because it's much quicker if somebody else has done the job and it's an authoritative job. So that report then goes on of the kind that, well, Pierre's got some examples here. We do reports after each one, and the reports themselves provide collective spirit and collective information.
But that wasn't the best of it, in a sense. That was the precursor to the next stage of this particular version of Russell. We went to New York. And we went to New York at the time that the United Nations were opening for their autumn session. And we went to New York because, for two reasons. One, United Nations, history of international law, League of Nations first, all these instruments of international law, in a sense, at the end of the day, they come back to the United Nations, which is, if you like, a founder partner of all the conventions and treaties that have grown up. And without the United Nations being forceful, it's a reason why action is often not taken, because if the United Nations fails, then it's not a good example, particularly the Security Council. So there we had the opportunity, we had the meeting about the failures of the United Nations. Not difficult to itemize them. So it wasn't about the failures, it's about what are you, the United Nations, going to do about your failures on this front. Israel has violated more resolutions by the Security Council and the General Assembly than any other state. More violations. Nothing happens. So we then get the opportunity. And again, it's a recognition that Russell is having an impact. They allowed us an audience with, if you like, one of the committees that deals with the Middle East and Palestine. So all the countries on this committee, again, I think there are about 30. It's all online. You can watch it on the Russell website. We presented to them not just what the failures were. We're saying, as a result, we are suggesting a number of things have to change. I'm just going to mention one of them. One of the most obvious things that's got to change is the Security Council. It doesn't represent all the nations of the world. It's not meant to, but it's got to do better than it is. And we've got to do away with a veto. So the 5 big nations, including the US and the UK, UK does its usual perfidious Albin and sort of abstains. But the US always opposes anything on this, so you can't get anywhere. So we are saying, it's no use us saying all these things. You have to go away and do something about it. Now, I'm not sure how much has changed since then. All I do know is that a week later, a week after we were there, I'm not putting it down to Russell, I'm just saying it's a little brick in the wall that's building up. There was the historic vote on the status of Palestine. And a historic vote that was overwhelmingly in favour of an upgrade. All right, it's only to Vatican-type status, and that doesn't answer everything, but what it does do, it opens the avenue of legal channels, the possibility of Palestine going to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, still being negotiated. I'm afraid the leadership in Palestine, in my view, hasn't had the courage of the people on the streets yet to actually go. And why? Because there's a lot of browbeating and blackmail going on behind the scenes. The Americans don't want them to go, and neither do the English. The English do it behind the scenes. You go to the International Criminal Court, and we will withdraw funding. So it's a big stick that's being wielded. But the doors are slowly being opened. People are beginning to recognize that the channels that have been laid down, perfectly legitimate channels, have to be activated. And the have to be activated is being underlined by things like the Russell Tribunal. Now, finally on the Russell, sorry, I've said quite a bit on it, but I feel strongly about its effect. Because you need to know that it has a presence. A month ago, go to Brussels again. This time, we'd had a final roundup in Brussels a year ago, but this time reconvened the panel of judges, reconvened the whole essence of it on one single issue, Gaza. Operation Cast Lead. Don't need to go into the details. You're probably aware of how horrific it's been, the number of children and women killed, never mind the rest of it. And the idea was not to establish the facts. Of course, we did a bit of that. There's another organisation doing that as well. We don't need to do that. It's fairly well documented. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? And the interesting thing, once again, because of the organisation, Pierre to my right, of Russell, and because it's had reports of the kind that he's got there, that it's recognised that it has an authority. Because we're not just a bunch of radicals with, some mission beyond it. No. All we're doing, and this is all Stefan Hessel wanted us to do, was to actually implement international law that stands there, that was been put there by other people. And we got the opportunity to address membership of the European Parliament. Now that's quite an honour, quite a privilege, however bureaucratic it may be, to be able to sit in one of the main chambers and put forward our report, which we did. And I was just saying to Pierre before we came in, the next stage is we've got to go back to the European Parliament saying, what are you doing? Because the European Parliament has a special economic relationship with a non-European state. Which one? Israel. They get better preferential economic treatment than some of the European states. So this doesn't make any sense. We say it's fine if they begin to become susceptible to the rule of law, but as far as I'm concerned, they're outside the rule of law. In other words, they are themselves almost a pariah state because they don't take any notice. And until they take notice of these resolutions and these judgments and these opinions, then the European Union would be quite entitled to say, as they do to other European potential members, you can't become a part of our family until you've signed up to human rights. So we say, let's have that applied to Israel. So that's a short synopsis of what we've been doing on Russell, and I think it's very important. And we will go on doing it. So if there are other issues on the issue of Palestine that arise in the next year or so, we'll reconvene and we'll do it again, because they bank on the fact we'll give up. They bank on the fact that we'll get tired. Well, mark my words, none of us are tired of doing that job. And we will be back doing it again when the next, and there'll be more, and Netanyahu has already said that Operation Cast Lead was a success. There'll be another one. They have allocated a budget already for the next one. So there'll be another one, probably within the year. So I hope not to have to come back and talk about that. So I'm going to move on from Russell to talk about, how am I doing? Oh my goodness. Right. Can I have 5 of your minutes, please? Sorry, you're out of this.
You two fight it out.
We'll fight it out, yeah. Because the next thing is, I come back to the UK for a moment, not the international ones, which you want to hear about. Well, there's been some interesting developments in the United Kingdom. One of them I've brought here today. I'm not asking for it to be shown, but it's a bit like what's been going on in Iran, in the sense of the production. This is a film of another People's Commission, they called it. Now, again, I don't know how many... Well, I'm going to ask, has anybody followed what's been going on in the United Kingdom to the National Health Service? Nobody. Well, that's good. Then I can say what I like. No, all right. A few of you have. Sorry, I just don't want to, as it were, go over ground you're all very familiar with, but I'll put it in short form. There's a film there and a report. That's what the community produced. It's an amazing production. Now, what happened here, and I think it's worth noting how this worked, actually worked. So, go back 1 year. The Minister for Health, whose name I have to get correct each time, Jeremy Hunt, came up with some really quite outrageous proposals for the health service. And the outrageous proposals he had for the health service, that is hospitals in South London, there were 4. I'm not going to name them all except the one that's at the centre of this, Lewisham. This is an inner city borough, very mixed, very poor. But this hospital, Lewisham, was without question one of the most, it's in the top 6 hospitals in the United Kingdom for medical care. And what did Jeremy Hunt want to do? He wanted to close it. Why did he want to close it? Oh, it's a sort of medical reorganisation and we want to rationalise. You've heard all these terms before, of course. Now, the chronology is he makes these announcements, and of course, they don't want public consultation. They say they're going to have it, but it's not going to be in depth, is it? And the public in Lewisham, much to everybody's amazement, came out on the streets. 22,500 people took to the streets for a march to save a hospital. And they did that, doctors, ordinary citizens, everybody, because it was a community hospital. It was seen as somewhere they could walk to. It was seen as somewhere where they would get consideration and care and aftercare and so on in all the various departments. They couldn't believe that he wanted to close it. So he backed off a bit and said, well, I won't close. I'll keep sort of token units, maternity units open, but actually it'll be referred to another hospital. So they said to themselves, we're not putting up with this. They did two things, and this is another question that was raised yesterday. They did two things. The communities, that is everybody concerned, and it's a very wide community there, as I've already said. They all came together collectively, whatever their political differences might have been, to say, right, we're going to fight this, from start to finish. But we're going to do it with a two-pronged attack. One is we're going to go to the courts. We're going to judicially review the decision that the minister is coming up with, which is another form within the British system of administratively challenging. Interesting, though, the government want to stop that. They're withdrawing legal aid for many of these challenges. And they're also making it more difficult. It's going to cost more to do it. They're restricting the time limit. I just mention it in parentheses because that's what's going on at the same time. The government's going, oops, we're having too many of these, a bit embarrassing. Better close that down, that avenue. But it wasn't closed down at that point. So they said, we'll mount a judicial review and we'll raise money and we'll try and get government money at that particular time for legal aid. And they were before the cuts on that particular form of legal aid. So they do that. But of course, a judicial review challenging the decision to close this hospital is very focused. And it was very focused on a particular issue called ultra-vires. Was the decision outside the scope of what the minister should be doing? So that was focused. But the public said, but it's a bigger issue. It's a much bigger issue. Now, I'm not going to take up time reading out the terms of reference. The committee said, we want something much wider than that. It isn't just about this particular decision. This is about government approach to the National Health Service. It is about privatisation. It is about selling off bits of the medical... And the NHS, beyond any other institution, perhaps, in this country, is the most revered institution. The public want it because actually it works. I mean, of course, there are mistakes, and we all know that in every walk of life. But basically, it's a well-intentioned resource that everybody can make use of from time to time. So that is why they said, no, we have to see what the hidden agenda is here. So we want a People's Commission to examine the political momentum behind these decisions so we can tie it all up and see what's happening throughout the whole of the country. Much bigger than the judicial review in the courts. But we liaised with the people, because obviously I knew the lawyers involved in the judicial review, to make sure we didn't do anything that embarrassed them, that made it more difficult for them. And we did it in tandem, so nothing we did would do anything more than support their application. And interestingly, the judicial review, as it turned out by pure coincidence, and the People's Commission all happened at the same time. Went to court and we held an actual hearing. Now, how did we get to the hearing? Because this is where I came in, because they approached me, said, would I run it? So I said, okay. I had to think through from the start the kind of model that would work. Now, what happened was, I went to my chambers, that's the organisation we call it in England, of other barristers, and I got, in the end, 22 barristers. In fact, they were, save one, they were all women in the set. All said, we'll do it. For nothing. For nothing. And of course, it shouldn't have to be like this. And in the end, some expenses were covered. But this is, you have to have people who are committed to do it. Not always easy to find, but they are out there. And then what I suggested was that we have a protocol. You have a series of people, a group of people who do the, as it were, not the fact-finding, but they go out and identify the factual issues that will need to be heard in evidence and identify the best people to give evidence and take statements in the way would normally be taken for a case. So a proper statement, not a letter, not written on the back of a postage stamp or whatever, but a proper statement in proper form with a declaration that the person is telling the truth. Because, again, you're back with time constraints. They could only afford to do it for one day. The mayor of Lewisham said, all right, you can have the town hall for nothing. Or, no, sorry, it was the theatre in the centre of Lewisham, but next to the town hall. You have it for nothing. And of course, that would have cost thousands for them to rent it for a whole day. So starting at 9 in the morning on a Saturday through to 5. So you can't hear all the witnesses. They were queuing outside to get in. You can't hear them all. So you have to ensure that what you can't actually hear on the day and film on the day in here, you can actually read. And we had a panel. A member of the House of Lords sat to my left and a writer sat to my right. And we heard witness after witness after witness, based on statements that had already been taken, give their own account Now, doctors came, surgeons came, very unusual because, of course, they're putting their jobs on the line by speaking out. But they were so angry about the fact that they hadn't really been consulted themselves. The individual citizens hadn't been consulted. You've got patients who gave their stories of how their families have been linked to this hospital for years, whose grandmothers were born in this hospital. They know this hospital. They love this hospital, and they were able to, as it were, convey the meaning of local care. And it wasn't just the GPs came, they all supported this hospital. And in fact, you wondered at the end of it what on earth Jeremy Hunt was doing. Well, you can read the report and find out. We had a simple conclusion, won't surprise any of you. The reason why Jeremy Hunt wanted to do this is, again, it's a financial privatisation issue. That what had happened, and it's not just linked to the Tories, it was started by Tony Blair. Tony Blair had something called a private finance initiative. This was all about putting private money into hospitals. I said there were 4 hospitals. 3 of them were not in the same borough as this one. Those 3 were failing, not as hospitals, not because they had bad doctors, but because they weren't paying their way, because Tony Blair had set up contracts in which they could hardly pay back the loans, because who they're to private loan companies who are charging the earth. That's where, you know, your tax, well, not you, but taxpayers' money is going to pay off companies that have loaned money to the NHS for these hospitals. So what he wanted to do was to close a successful hospital under the guise of the other trust, as it were. This is where it became ultra-vires. Close this hospital and as it were, channel the money back in, over the border. Well, that's a simple point. It had to be explained. And of course, at the same time as we were winning the political battle, because it's a political issue, economic issue, in the People's Commission, and writing an interim report and then a full report, and this is the full report, the JR was going on, and they won the JR as well. So you had celebration on the streets of South London. I said, hold it, hold it, hold it. This lot are not going to give up. And Jeremy Hunt, having spent taxpayers' money on this on the changes plus fighting the JR, said, oh, no, you know, they're wrong, we'll fight it. They appealed the JR, the judicial review, and they lost again. I haven't calculated the millions of taxpayers' money that's been thrown away by a government committed to a policy that is entirely erroneous, and certainly in relation to Lewisham. But it had one desired effect. The desired effect for Lewisham: the hospital is still there. The hospital is still working. In other words, they've dug in, and we have an election coming up. So, this government has got enough problems with Mr. Farage, never mind everything else. So this government isn't going to close this hospital now. They have changed the ground rules so that in future, a future government could do it with much more ease than Jeremy Hunt had. So the story of the People's Commission, set up in a way in which we collated the evidence in advance. So it's a bit like here, Iran, you had a commission first and then you had the hearings. Well, we did it in statement form. On the day, it was like, well, it was a quasi-trial, a quasi, if you like, investigation, because we had more barristers, 6 other barristers who did the questioning, as it were, to lead the witness a bit into what they can say, because you've only got, 15 minutes to talk about a lifetime. So it's all constricted. So you need somebody who's got the structure of the questioning. And one of the problems with many of inquiries is that there's no structure. You absolutely have to ensure focused questions with focused answers. Never mind all the criticisms and so on that'll come at that. At least you get through. And at the end of that day, having done that, we invited Mr. Hunt. But like the Israeli government, they don't come, do they? So we got an actor to perform Jeremy Hunt. And the actor had culled, they were all Jeremy Hunt's words spoken on this issue, spoken in the debates and elsewhere. And of course, when you hear them spoken and you put it all together, on most occasions it produced laughter, because you couldn't believe that this man knew what he was talking about. Well, he didn't know what he was talking about. So we had it there. So there was the possibility, and we made, you know, a lot of hay out of the fact that they hadn't bothered to even respond. They hadn't even said, thank you for inviting us, but we're not coming for whatever reason. That's the arrogance of it. And this touches on a sort of key issue for me. which is overriding all of this, because we're now into another area that hasn't been talked about, I don't think, unless it was in the bit yesterday I missed, and that is the political background in the United Kingdom. I don't know how much of you know that at the moment the temperature is interesting. People are fed up. People believe that they have been alienated by the system. People believe they can't make a difference. People believe that the ballot box is not the place where it's going to happen, because they can't trust politicians. And they can't trust politicians because they put themselves above the law. The expenses scandal here is one very fine example of exactly where they did that. They not only, got you to pay for their Mars bars and their duck houses and all the rest of it, they then covered it up, and then they didn't want it brought out in the open until the Daily Telegraph got hold of it. That's the kind of democracy we don't have. In other words, we don't have a democracy. I call it a democratic bankruptcy that we're facing at the moment. And I think most people are beginning to wake up. And Farage, for all his faults, I'm not in favour of him at all, but on the other hand, he is tapping into the real antipathy towards the system, because there's no accountability. And the biggest example of no accountability, which is where people's commissions come in again, is the Iraq War. There is a consensus amongst lawyers that that was an illegal war. We've had an inquiry, a government inquiry, which still hasn't reported. The Chilcot inquiry is now 4 years waiting and waiting for the result, because, of course, most of us know it's going to be highly critical of Tony Blair going to war effectively on an illegal basis and without, as it were, democratic support. He got support of his cabinet, but he wouldn't he? So basically, you have a situation in which people say, well, why should we vote any of them in? And it's in that context that people are turning and saying, well, we'll take control. Occupy movement. We'll take control. People's commissions, tribunals, it doesn't matter what it is. They are beginning to realize that we all have the opportunity to say, well, we don't trust any of you in relation to this. And of course, the latest is the sex abuse scandal involving politicians. And it's interesting that the victims of this, and it's going on at this very minute, as I speak, the victims, I'm not trying to broadcast my own virtues because it doesn't matter in here, have asked me to do it. Has the government? I don't think so. They haven't even picked up the phone. They've appointed 2 people, both of whom are now highly suspect because of their connections with the system. They just don't know, well, they do know what they're doing. They don't really want to take it on in the way that would produce a thorough investigation of, if you like, truth and justice. But I just wanted to read it out. Sorry, I've overrun badly, but I thought it would be of interest. This came through yesterday. So if anybody amongst you are concerned about what is going on in this country and the need, this is a letter from a member of the Trades Council and the local steering group in Rotherham, that's in Yorkshire. There are a number of inquiries and investigations currently ongoing into various strands of the historic problem. The historic problem being child and sex abuse. That's what he's talking about. The National Crime Agency is investigating the conduct of the South Yorkshire Police. Ofsted has just completed its inspection of the children's services, and its report will be released in the next month. Louise Casey is conducting a corporate governance inspection of Rotherham Council. An internal inspection is to be conducted by Rotherham Council. Various council and police figures have been hauled before parliamentary select committees, and now there is talk of a criminal investigation into the former police and crime commissioner. However, that's been in the news. However, he's talking on behalf of the community, we have little faith in any of these processes and absolutely no confidence in the police investigating the police. We want to see a people's inquiry, bringing together all the various strands, and we want such an inquiry to be led by a credible figure. Well, I'll leave out the rest because you probably can guess who's inserted there. And they go on to say why the credible figure will do a better job. That's a special branch chopping me off. Sorry, I'm going to end. I'm sorry for overrunning, but as you can see, I'm somewhat caught up in these issues. So I'm going to say to them, so they'll know tomorrow. I'm going to say, yes, fine, let's get on with it. I'm rather busy in Hillsborough. Hillsborough is another, I can't talk about the case, but you all know, well, some of you know, Hillsborough disaster, 96 people died, big cover-up, the system didn't do the job, now we've got fresh inquests, at long last, 25 years later. So it's about asking questions. and never being afraid to ask questions. People's tribunals and commissions do that. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.